Hey, last week I started a teaching series that we've entitled Gotcha Questions. Okay, gotcha. Gotcha question is designed to trap someone into making a statement that's damaging or discrediting to their cause or their character. Behind the gotcha question, there's always a hidden agenda. And a scripture records 6 gotcha questions that are directed at Jesus, and that's going to be our outline for the next couple of weeks. His response to those questions is always so revealing as to his character and who he was, and therefore it becomes a model for us of how we should be. The gotcha question we're going to study this morning comes from a very familiar text, and that is a good thing. I've taught on this passage before. It's a good thing because, once again, I spent 2 days in continuing ed this week. It's just been a busy week. This week, this morning, we are in Luke 10. And this text really has been formative in regard to who we are as a church, kind of our mission, our identity. And so even though it's a familiar text and I'm repeating some things, I think this is really valuable to be reminded of this. Luke 10, you ready? On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus, and there's our word that indicates this is a gotcha question. Test. Gotcha question is coming. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? What would an expert in Jewish religious law and in the scriptures, why would they ask that question? The answer is this is a pre-planned plot to somehow trap Jesus. Verse 26, what is written in the law? Jesus replied, how do you read it? So Jesus just wisely reflects the question back to the person who asked him. This expert in the law answered, verse 27, love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. You have answered correctly, Jesus replied. And if we stopped right there, this would be a very short passage. The guy has gotten it right, glad that everybody knew that he got it right, and happy to go home, except for the fact that this is a gotcha question, and for the fact that Jesus sort of pokes him back by saying, do this, and you will live. Do this. Love is an action verb. It's not an emotion. It is to act in a manner that is best for the individual or for yourself, because we're supposed to love ourselves. Do this. That statement also shows that it's possible to have the right answer and live the wrong life. And Christians actually get really mixed up about this. We sometimes think that spiritual maturity is someone who knows a lot about the Bible and is able to give the correct answer. But that is not what Jesus says. The main thing to God is that we actually do this. To love God with all we have and to love our neighbor as ourselves as God defines love. And so Jesus asks the question, the guy comes back with the right answer, and Jesus says, you answered correctly, that's cool. But then he adds, but do it. And so now the guy can't walk away. He's been convicted by Jesus' response. Now he's hooked. Verse 29. But he wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, well, and who is my neighbor? He wants to justify. He wants to look good, to be regarded as right or superior, just as all legalists do. He wanted to know, well, who's my neighbor? He wanted to know who's he supposed to love and who does he not have to love. He wants Jesus to draw this circle. So imagine the circle. He wanted Jesus to explain, well, who's in the circle? of this neighbor that I'm required to love. Who's in that category? Who am I obligated to love? And there actually was some debate among Jewish rabbis about this. Some rabbis would say, well, your neighbor is the devout Israelite, someone who loves Torah, who loves God. And then there were other rabbis who said, no, it's a little broader than that. It would also include your sort of average Joe Jew, even though they're not scrupulous about obeying the Torah or the religious traditions. They're in that circle. You have to love them. And then there might be a few, not many, who would actually say, well, it's everybody in Israel, even those that we consider sinners and the outcasts. Pretty much nobody, however, would say that the neighbor included Gentiles and Samaritans. They were considered enemies of God. And so the question is, again, who fits in this circle? How broad is this circle of neighbor that I'm obligated to love? And Jesus is going to bring a fundamentally different view to that command. Now, when we say somebody ought to do something, I mentioned this a couple weeks ago. There are two ways of looking at that word ought. There is the ought of obligation. You ought to do this. You're required to do this. And then there's the ought of opportunity. The ought of obligation is something you have to do out of pressure or necessity or some sort of moral, societal dictate. The ought to of opportunity is more like, oh, you can't miss this chance. This is so good, you ought to do this. For the religious guy, you ought to love your neighbor is the ought of obligation. So he wants to know who fits into this category. How do I know whether I'm under the obligation to love this person, or I don't have to love this person? And for Jesus, love is not an obligation. It's our greatest opportunity. It's why we live, to be able to love one another. It makes us alive. The more you love, the more alive you are. And so Jesus has to figure out how he's going to sort of pierce this guy's defenses. And so he tells a very familiar story to us. And in the story, he changes the question. Verse 30. In reply, Jesus said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. And it literally was down. Jerusalem to Jericho, 17 miles. It snaked through the rocks and the ravines down. And oftentimes then, in that dangerous sort of road, criminals would hide, lying in wait for their next victim. The road was actually referred to as the Way of Blood. It was so dangerous to travel that road. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. That's all Jesus says about this man going down to Jericho. Was the guy, was he a good guy? Was he a bad guy? We don't know. Jesus doesn't say. Was he an Israelite? Was he a Gentile? We don't know. Jesus doesn't say. The New Living Translation says it was a Jewish man, but in the original language, it just says a certain man. There's only one guy now in this circle. You ought to love this person. One guy is there, and we know nothing about him. We don't know who he was, what he was like. It was just some guy. Jesus is not going to answer the question, who is my neighbor? He's not going to answer, who is in this circle? Instead, in this parable, Jesus has three people in the neighbor-loving group, the person who is supposed to love their neighbor, the love-giver category. The first one is a priest. The second one is a Levite. And the third one we'll come to in a moment. You know who it was, but if you were hearing this story for the very first time, you don't know who it was, and it would be a surprise to you. In other words, Jesus is not going to answer, who am I obligated to love? He doesn't answer it because love is our greatest opportunity. Instead, Jesus is answering, what kind of person must I be to be this love giver? Whole different question. Jesus goes on with this story, verse 31. A priest happened to be going down the same road. A priest, educated in the law. He can recite the commandments. He leads worship. He prays. And so he's reminded all the time about God's love and God's mercy and God's forgiveness. Surely love has been formed in this man, except it hasn't. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. He walks on by, but worse than that, in the text you get this sense that he actually walked to the other side of the road. We expected him to be the hero in the story. He was the priest. He's the model to emulate. If anyone is going to reflect the character and compassion of God, it would be the priest. But he doesn't. The story continues. And so too, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, he passed by on the other side. A Levite, sort of like a temple assistant, again, educated in the Torah. Again, surely love has been formed in this guy, except it hasn't. We expect him to be the hero in the story, the model to emulate, but he isn't. He walks on by. After doing sort of a Gawker slowdown, the text actually indicates that. He looked at him, but he kept going. Jesus continues, verse 33. But a Samaritan, and this is the punchline in the story. Samaritans were considered half-breeds. They were despised by the Jewish people. Nobody listening to the story would have anticipated this guy. A Samaritan came, and as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. And then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. It's about 2 days' wages. Look after him, he said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. And so Jesus comes to the end of his story, and he asks, verse 36, which of these 3 do you think was the neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robber? Again, the question is no longer who is eligible. It's no longer who qualifies to receive love. The question is no longer who fits into this circle of people I have to love, or who is God obligating me to love. That's not the question, because God's greatest opportunity is to love. It's not an obligation. The question is, what kind of person is able to offer love? The priest, we would expect no. The Levite, we would expect no. But it's the Samaritan. Verse 37. The expert in the law replies to Jesus' question. The one who had mercy on him. It is so telling. He can't even bring himself to say the word Samaritan. He can't even utter the word. Jesus told him, go and do likewise. He tells the entire story to come back to this one phrase, go and do. Love is an action verb. Go do that. Now, That's not always easy. There are some people who are difficult to love. Sometimes they go to the same church as you do. Where do you find the ability to love difficult people? Well, we always come back to this. This is where it starts. We love because he first loved us. 1 John 4, verse 19. And as we comprehend the height, the depth, the breadth of God's love for us, then we extend love on that horizontal level to others. It always comes back to this, remembering that days, perhaps weeks, after Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan, Jesus himself is stripped of his clothes, beaten within inches of his life, and left to die on a cross. But he willingly allowed that. He suffered. He died on a cross for us, and he did that because he refused to walk by on the other side of the road and leave us die in our sin. He had compassion on us, offering us healing for our soul that we so desperately needed. We don't deserve that kind of love, and so we love our neighbors because he first loved us. Pretty straightforward parable. It's so powerful. But then we need to dig just a little bit deeper to apply it. I always want to know, why is it that Jesus so often portrays religious people in such a bad light? Why is that? Then a more challenging question as we bridge that to contemporary society: can we see the modern church reflected in the priest or the Levite's actions in the parable? Being religious, but passing by those who are wounded and discarded on the side of the road of life. Now, years ago I came across this as I was teaching on this passage, and it's one of those things that actually was just a defining moment, a turning point in how I thought about church. It came actually from a vision statement of a church in our area, and it's a good church, by the way. I'm not knocking this church. I'm not going to tell you the name of it, but this church had a mission statement, and it appeared just like this. Took it right out of their literature. And they said, our strategic initiatives is this: we want to develop and implement a community outreach strategy focused on the needs of Dakota. Okay? Good church. They want to do outreach. They want to reach people. And they developed this kind of cool little acrostic or acronym? Acronym, thank you. Acronym for this is Dakota County. This is our mission field. And so the D in Dakota stood for dual income. And the A, affluent. K, kids and kid-centered. O, overly committed financially. T is time crunched. And A is absorbed in our own world. You know, and that acronym is a somewhat accurate reflection of the suburban community. They're absolutely right. And so it's a very clever way of packaging their vision statement. They're saying that, you know, their programs, their activities are going to be evaluated in light of the effectiveness in reaching that target group, Dakota. But I think every church south of the river, whether they state it plainly as this church does or not, they have the very same ministry focus. They want to reach Dakota right there. And in doing so, what they have done is passed by on the other side of the road and walked away from tens of thousands of people who were wounded on the side of the road. If our focus is dual income, who have we overlooked? Well, the unmarried, the separated, the divorced, about 40% of the adult population. And you know what? And many of them feel like they would say, we're second-class citizens in the church. Yeah, the church is focused on dual income, mom and dad with their kids. If we are focused on the affluent, who have we passed by on the other side of the road? Most single moms who are struggling to make ends meet. The ex-prisoner who is struggling to find a job or even a place to live because they have a felony record. The economically disadvantaged. Kids and kid-centered. If that's our mission focus, who does that leave by the side of the road? Well, those who don't or can't have children, the empty nesters, the elderly. Overcommitted financially, time crunched, absorbed in our own world. Well, that could apply to many, but it's clear that this church's focus, their intent was to reach the young urban professional who's climbing the corporate ladder, the college educated, the white collar, those who come demanding professional services at church. Who does that leave lying alongside the road? Probably the recovering addict and those who are so wounded and scarred by this sinful world that they actually have difficulty sort of functioning, the less educated, the poor, and the list goes on. And so often the local church, if they see these people at all, they pass to the other side of the road and hope that maybe some parachurch ministry will be able to attend to their needs. Jesus finishes the story. Jesus finishes the story. And the listeners were expecting something other than what they got. That's the beauty of this story. They expected the next guy down the road, again, to be that average, good guy, Jew. The hero in the story would be the regular Joe, the common Joe, Jew. That would have been such a slap in the face of the religious establishment, and the common people loved Jesus' parables because of that. He wasn't supporting the religious hierarchy. But Jesus tells a story, and the next person down the road, Samaritan. We talk about the Good Samaritan, that's sort of common language for us, but that phrase would have never been used by the Jew in Jesus' day. They despised the Samaritans. And so Jesus' shocking ending of the parable just absolutely increases the power of the parable to convict us. And it should lead us to pray something like this. God, forgive me. I would have walked by too. And so give me eyes that do not look away and feet that do not turn to the other side of the road. Give me a heart of compassion and love by replacing that prideful self-importance that allows me to rank people in importance and keeps me from meeting their needs, those who are discarded by the road of life. And so we did this a number of years ago. Again, I'm reminding you of this because I want to be a part of a church that understands that parable, who's not going to walk to the other side of the road. And so we've done this as homework before. Let's rewrite the acronym Dakota. What does the D stand for? If we're going to be a part of a church that understands the parable of the Good Samaritan, we're not going to walk to the other side of the road and look away from the needy and the hurting. What does D stand for? What's our mission field? How about down and out? We're going to develop a strategy that will reach the down and out. How about the disadvantaged? How about disgruntled? No, we don't want to do that. We've done that before. Disgruntled people from another church coming, yeah, they're going to make a mess out of us. Down and out, disgruntled. What would the A stand for? How about, instead of affluent, how about Afflicted. There's a nice New Testament word. Jesus heals our afflictions. How about addict? K, instead of kid and kid-centered, although yes, we want to reach the whole family. How about knocked down, the kicked around? Oh, how about overlooked, the outcast? There's another just wonderful New Testament word. Because the outcast, they were outcasts because the religious community couldn't associate with them. They were the lepers, the ones they considered sinful. No, Jesus loved them and he died for them and he reaches out to them. T, well, how about turned off by religiosity and churchy activities? A, the alone. There are so many lonely people in this world. How about the abused? To be a church community that reaches that mission field, it doesn't start with programming. You know, it starts with heart surgery. We need to start with that prayer that I had just read. I'll read it again. God, forgive me, forgive us. We would have walked by too. And so give us eyes that do not look away, and feet that do not turn to the other side of the road. Give us a heart of compassion by replacing that prideful self-importance that allows us to rank people in importance. Isn't that a good line? There's no ranking of importance in God's eyes, his heart for people. And keeps us from meeting the needs of those discarded along the road of life. Isn't that a good prayer? Amen. Anybody got any comments or questions about Luke chapter 10? It is a powerful parable. I would love to hear Kathy. I always have my antagonist in the back row. Nice and loud, Kathy.
There's so much more to that. I don't know. There's just so much more to that. One person said, this is a pastor's wife, she said, you know, it's not possible as human beings for us to love everybody. She said, leave that up to Jesus. She said, your job is to love somebody. And to me, that seems more realistic.
We cannot live this lifestyle in our own power. We absolutely cannot. It is the Spirit working through us, convicting us that we ourselves were along the side of the road when Jesus died on the cross for us. And that so floods our heart with that proper perspective of ourselves that now we go, and I'm going to be like Jesus to one other person, to someone else. And when you get a church community that embraces that and understands that, I'm telling you, you can smell it. And it is the sweet fragrance of Jesus. It really is. Jennifer, come on up. Because we will actually sort of implant the application with just a little spiritual course. Because we pray, make me like Jesus. That's the morning prayer. Today, just make me like Jesus. Let me love the people that I come across in my path of life. And because it is an opportunity. It's not an obligation. So, are you ready, Jennifer? Let's sing, and we'll make this just our closing prayer today.